She followed her dog into silence, where every footstep pulled her closer to memories she didn't know still lived inside strangers' hearts. At the dance hall, a man cried, holding a photo of her at 17, saying she vanished the night his life began. A soldier collapsed at her feet, clutching his chest, whispering that her voice once pulled him back from death in the jungle. A chapel woman begged for forgiveness, revealing letters she'd never stopped writing to a mother who vanished without ever saying goodbye. Her adopted daughter screamed through tears, holding a bracelet, proof she'd been loved by a woman who was told the baby died. Each stop cracked her soul wider, until someone whispered, "You forgot us all, but we never forgot you." Then the dog stopped walking. And the final memory made her fall to her knees. Alan, the quiet friend who never left her side, couldn't yet know that the woman he was helping once saved his life in Vietnam. Ellie, the art teacher abandoned as a child, had no idea her volunteer partner was the very nurse who rocked her to sleep as a baby. And Margaret, the woman with no memory, certainly had no idea that the child she thought died in 1963 had been searching for her all along. It all began with the way the morning sunlight stretched across the porch, casting long lines like bars of a quiet prison, soft and golden but unyielding. She sat there, wrapped in that old woolen shawl that had once been blue, or maybe green, depending on the year and the light, nobody could say anymore. Her hands rested gently on her lap, fingers curled not from fear, nor from cold, but from time itself, which bends things without asking permission. The wind stirred the trees in the distance, a whispering hush that felt almost respectful, as if the world around her had agreed to keep quiet. The house behind her, with its flaking paint and uneven steps, had once held voices and music, and smells of coffee and pine cleaner on Saturdays. But now, silence reigned, except for the occasional creak of old wood and the slow, steady breathing of the dog curled at her feet like a guardian. He was a German shepherd, strong in the hips still, though gray traced the edges of his muzzle like the frost that came too early in October. He watched her, not just with loyalty, but with something deeper, like he knew he had a job to do and not much time left to do it. She didn't speak much anymore. Words had started slipping away a while back, first names, then places, then the little things like why you open the fridge. The doctors called it memory loss, age-related decline, early dementia, words that sounded clinical, like they were meant for charts, not for people with baby albums. But to her, it just felt like someone had come in during the night and carefully taken parts of her life and hidden them in strange places. And so each morning she sat, quiet and still, watching the light change and petting the dog, who always stayed close, like he understood what was missing. He was the only thing she hadn't forgotten, not completely. There was a warmth in his eyes that cut through the fog, just enough to matter. On that morning, the one where it all truly began, the dog stood up slowly, stretched his legs, and looked back at her with calm insistence. He barked once. Not loud, not sharp, just enough to say "come with me," as if the day itself had been waiting for this signal. She hesitated, her body remembering the stiffness before her mind remembered the reason for it, but eventually she pushed herself up with a groan. There was no plan in her movement, no destination in her mind, just the certainty that the dog knew something she didn't, and that was enough. They walked down the front steps, her hand grazing the wooden railing like it might tell her something if she touched it just right. The town around them was the same as always, weathered storefronts, slow traffic, telephone poles like sentinels, but something in the air had shifted, quiet and electric. The dog led her with purpose, taking slow strides to match her shuffle, down streets that seemed familiar but gave up no names, no details, only feelings. He stopped in front of a building with tall windows covered in dust, a sign hanging crookedly above the door, its letters half-worn but still legible. It read, Oak Street Dance Hall, EST 1954. And though her eyes narrowed and her mouth remained still, something stirred beneath her ribs. The dog pushed the door open with his nose, and a wave of musty air spilled out, carrying with it a whisper of perfume and floor wax and lost time. Inside, the hall was dim but not dark, and in the middle of it stood a man with silver hair and a broom, moving in long, slow arcs. He looked up as they entered, froze, and then let out a breath that trembled, like he'd been holding it for 30 years waiting for her shadow to return. He leaned on the broom like a cane, eyes locked on hers, and smiled, not out of joy, but reverence, like greeting a memory that refused to die. "My God," he whispered, the words soft as snow, "you're still alive." And then louder, steadier, "You don't remember me, do you?" She stared at him, unsure if the tears in her eyes were from recognition or just the dust, but her feet carried her a step closer anyway. He nodded slowly, eyes glistening, and said the kind of thing that feels impossible until someone finally says it out loud. "We never finished our last dance." "I remember the shoes," she said, slowly at first, like the words were climbing out of a cellar that had been sealed too long. "And the man," still leaning on that old broom like it was the only thing holding the room together, nodded with the kind of certainty that comes from waiting. "Red ones," he whispered back, the memory slipping easily from his tongue, "scuffed toes from the first night you wore them, and you tripped on the second step." She didn't smile exactly, but the right corner of her mouth twitched, the way a porch swing might creak in the breeze after a long winter. He stepped toward her then, slowly, the broom forgotten, his shoes tapping the warped wood floor like it still remembered the rhythm of long-ago dances. "You were nervous," he said, almost to himself now, as if the words could rebuild that night plank by plank, "but you danced like nobody else ever could." She lowered her eyes, not out of shame or pride, but because something in her bones told her this man was telling the truth. "I was 17, she murmured, unsure why that number mattered, but certain that it belonged to her, like a birthday etched on the underside of a locket. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photograph, faded and soft at the corners, and held it out with hands that trembled slightly. "You gave me this," he said, voice thick now, "after the county fair, right before your father told you not to see me anymore." The photograph showed two teenagers, barely grown, standing under a string of paper lanterns, her red shoes front and center like they stole the show. Her fingers brushed the photo's edge, and a jolt ran through her, the kind that doesn't come from electricity, but from something far older and quieter. "I wore those shoes for luck," she said, the sentence building as she spoke it, "but that night, I just wanted to feel like someone special." The man laughed gently, not mocking, not even amused, just full of that soft ache that only comes from missing someone for too long. "You were special," he said, "so special, you didn't even need to try, but you never believed it, did you?" She looked at him, really looked this time, and in his eyes saw not just age or kindness, but a deep, stubborn loyalty that hadn't aged a day. The dog sat quietly beside her, still as stone, but his ears flicked forward, sensing something had shifted, something important had stirred in the air. "I don't remember your name," she admitted, and though it should have stung, the man only nodded, because he understood that remembering names came last, not first. "It's Alan," he said gently, "but don't worry about that, just remember how you felt when you danced, and I'll handle the rest." He extended his hand, not to shake, not to hold, but as if offering a memory she could borrow, just for a moment. She didn't take it, not yet, but she stepped a little closer, and that meant more than any handshake ever could. Alan smiled, stepped back, and gestured toward the far side of the dance hall, where a dusty jukebox leaned against the wall like a tired old man. "She always played number 17, he said, and as he spoke, the music kicked on, a soft trumpet followed by a slow, swaying piano. Her shoulders straightened, her breath caught, and without thinking she closed her eyes, and for a heartbeat, the years peeled away like old wallpaper in the rain. When the song ended, Alan turned toward her again, not smiling now, but solemn, as if remembering something he had promised long ago but never fulfilled. "There's someone else who remembers you," he said, "someone who never stopped lighting a candle for you every Christmas morning." Her brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in that fragile state between knowing and not knowing, when the mind begins to circle something important. "Why?" she asked, voice low, trembling not from fear but from the weight of wanting to know something too big for words. Alan paused, looked down, then met her eyes again, still full of history, but also something else, sorrow wrapped in gentleness. "Because you saved his life," he said quietly, in a place where most people left others behind. He was bleeding through his shirt, the voice said, steady and low, like the rumble of thunder still miles away but coming closer. She turned slowly, the dog already standing between her and the door, not growling, just alert, like he'd been expecting this moment to arrive. Out of the dimness stepped a tall man in a military coat, his gait stiff, his face lined not just with years but with burden. The medals on his chest were polished, but the eyes above them had seen more than any man was ever meant to remember. He didn't wear a hat, but his posture carried the kind of discipline that doesn't fade, not even after decades of civilian life. She studied him, searching for familiarity, but found only a flicker of something, a shadow of recognition that came and went like a summer storm. You were there, he continued, voice still calm but now with a tremor, in that field hospital outside Da Nang, the one hit by mortars. Alan stepped aside, silent now, watching with the reverence of a man who knew when a memory deserved its own stage, its own reckoning. You bent over me, the man said, pointing gently to the spot below his ribs, right here, where the shrapnel tore through my lung like a blade. I was screaming, panicked, he added, but your hands didn't shake, not once, and you looked me in the eyes and told me I'd live. She blinked slowly, her lips parting just a little, as though something inside her had stirred for the first time in years. I remember a boy, she whispered, young, barely more than a teenager, holding onto a dog tag like it was a prayer. He nodded, emotion tightening his jaw, and took a cautious step forward, not wanting to frighten her, but needing to close the space between them. That was me, he said, and then gently added, Private First Class George Holloway. You stayed with me when the others ran for cover. Her knees buckled slightly, but the dog pressed against her leg, steadying her with the kind of support that doesn't ask for thanks. I tied your chest with gauze, she murmured, her hand twitching as if holding invisible cloth, and told you to breathe with me, in rhythm. George's voice broke just a little as he replied, you told me, if the body forgets, the heart remembers. Let the heart do the breathing. She covered her mouth, gasping as the words returned to her, not as thoughts, but as echoes, powerful and undeniable, carved deep into memory. You were 19, she said, tears now sliding quietly down her cheeks, and you kept saying you couldn't die until your mama got your letter. He reached into his coat and pulled out something small, an envelope, yellowed and creased, its seal broken but intact in spirit. I still have it, he said, placing it gently in her hands. You wrote it for me. You made sure she knew I loved her. She held the letter as though it were made of glass, her fingers trembling, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs that came not from sadness, but from return. George looked to Alan, then back at her, his voice softer now, almost reverent, as he added, you saved more than my life, you saved what came after. I had a son, he continued, his voice swelling with pride and ache, and a granddaughter now, named after the nurse who wouldn't let go. She didn't speak, couldn't speak, not right away, but her eyes, once dull and glassy, now shimmered with something powerful, purpose remembered. George placed a hand gently on her shoulder, and for a long moment, no one spoke, the jukebox quiet, the hall still, the world holding its breath. When she finally looked up, voice dry and distant, she asked, why did I leave? Why didn't I stay in that life? George didn't answer, not right away, because it wasn't his place to guess, but he looked to Alan, who slowly stepped forward again. I think, Alan said carefully, you were carrying more pain than you let anyone see, and one day, it just got too heavy. The woman nodded slowly, her eyes drifting toward the exit, where the dog now waited, tail still, ears perked, gaze fixed ahead. There's someone else we need to find, she said quietly, more to herself than to them, someone I hurt worse than anyone else. She waits for you every Sunday, said the woman in the white coat, her voice hushed but unwavering, as though sacred truths required softer volume. The chapel was modest, no towering ceilings or stained glass, just wooden pews that creaked with age and a single window where morning light spilled like milk. The nurse stood by the open door, one hand resting gently on the frame, not blocking the way, just guiding like a lighthouse in fog. The woman, still leaning slightly on the German shepherd, paused at the threshold, eyes scanning the interior, uncertain of what waited inside but drawn just the same. Alan, who had driven them after the encounter with George, stood a respectful distance behind, his hat in hand, head bowed like a man in prayer. The dog gave a soft nudge to her leg, not a push, just a reminder that some doors don't open again once passed by. She stepped inside slowly, each footfall cautious, not from fear but from something older than fear, the weight of memory beginning to awaken inside her bones. The chapel smelled of wax and old hymnals, the kind of scent that brings back Sunday shoes and dresses ironed on Saturday night. At the far end, sitting alone on the third pew, was a woman dressed in gray, hands clasped tight around a tiny, leather-bound Bible. Her hair was silver, not from age alone but from long seasons of worry and waiting, her posture erect but not rigid, dignified in stillness. As the older woman approached, something stirred in the woman on the pew, her spine straightened more, her eyes wide with the tremor of hope. The woman with the dog stopped 2 rows away, not ready to sit yet, needing to see this figure before her as something real, not imagined. "You came back," the seated woman said, her voice cracking but not breaking, like an old violin playing the first note after years of silence. "I'm not sure why," the woman replied, quietly, "except that the dog knew the way, and maybe my heart remembered something I forgot." The woman in gray looked down at her Bible, then back up, tears filling her eyes not because she was sad, but because she dared to believe. "Every Sunday," she said, gently patting the pew beside her, "I came here and asked God to help you find yourself again." They sat together, side by side, and for a while there were no words, just the sounds of breath, the ticking of a wall clock, and the stillness of peace. "I didn't mean to disappear," the woman said, hands trembling as she folded them, "but one day I couldn't carry the past and the present anymore." The woman in gray nodded slowly, eyes on the altar now, her voice distant like she was speaking to someone long gone. "I was angry for a long time," she said, "but not because you left, because you never told me why you had to. I think," the older woman answered, choosing each word with care, "I was afraid that if I stayed, I'd lose what was left of me." "I kept your letters," the other woman whispered, almost reverently, "every single one, even the ones with no dates or names. I knew they were from you." The dog rested his head on the floor, eyes closed, as though satisfied that his burden had been carried one step further toward healing. From her coat, the older woman pulled out a folded paper, creases like rivers running through it, and placed it gently in her companion's hands. "It's a name I wrote once," she said softly, "I think it's yours, but I wasn't sure until just now." The woman in gray unfolded the paper, read the name slowly, and smiled through her tears, small, broken, but real, like sunrise after a long storm. "I used to write it on the margins of your notes," she said, holding it like something sacred, just to see it next to yours. They sat a while longer, saying little, but in the space between them something that had been shattered began to mend, not loudly, not all at once, but surely. The bell in the chapel tower rang once, no service today, just a reminder that time still passed, even when hearts tried to hold it still. As the older woman rose, her legs stiff but her resolve stronger, she turned to the woman in gray and asked softly, "Do you forgive me?" The other woman didn't answer with words, just stood up, took her hand, and held it with the strength of someone who had never truly let go. Outside, as they stepped into the light again, Alan looked toward the next road, and with a steady voice asked, "Do you remember the farmhouse on Ridge Road?" "I remember a fire," she said, her voice tightening like a rope pulled slowly across the years, and a boy screaming my name through the smoke. Alan didn't say anything right away, just kept his eyes on the long gravel road ahead, the one that cut through wheat fields like a memory too stubborn to die. The old station wagon bumped along in silence, the German shepherd curled quietly in the back, his head resting on her knee like a weight of reassurance. The sky had turned a pale gray, not from storm but from the kind of stillness that settles in before something important is about to break open. She pressed her hand against the window, as if the passing fields might whisper back some detail she'd lost along the way, some name or scent or sound. "I was maybe 20, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else, and the farmhouse was new, fresh paint, curtains I made with my own hands. Alan kept driving, the only sound coming from the tires and the occasional flap of wind against the side mirror, each mile digging deeper into memory. There was a boy, she continued, eyes narrowing, curly hair, always asking questions, and a smell, kerosene maybe, before the heat came roaring like a freight train. The words trembled as they came, not from weakness, but from the pressure of too many years pressing down on too few moments of clarity. I ran back in, she said, eyes now glassy, even though the neighbors were screaming at me not to, but I had to find him. Alan gripped the wheel tighter, as if the story itself had taken hold of the vehicle, and he was only along for the reckoning. They reached the turn, an old wooden sign still leaning there, Ridge Road, carved in faded letters, half swallowed by ivy and time itself. The house came into view slowly, or what remained of it, just the stone chimney now, and the outline of a foundation half swallowed by earth and weeds. She stepped out of the car slowly, boots crunching the gravel like it might hurt to disturb the silence that had lived here too long. The dog followed close, tail low but steady, sniffing the air like he already knew this place held something she needed to face. And there, by the stump of an old oak tree, stood a man, mid-50s, maybe older, with arms folded and a face like carved granite. He didn't speak at first, just watched her the way you watch a ghost return, uncertain if it came for forgiveness or just to haunt. When he finally stepped forward, it was with the stiff grace of a man who taught himself how to walk without leaning on the past. "I never thought I'd see you again," he said, the words slow and careful, like he was trying not to let them break midair. "I didn't think I'd come back," she replied, her voice quieter now, "not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't think I was allowed." The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a blackened photograph, charred at the corners but still showing two faces, hers and a child's. "He screamed your name," the man said, handing her the picture, "right up until you grabbed him by the arm and pulled him through the back door." Her hands shook as she took it, a gasp catching in her throat like the air had turned solid and wouldn't move. "I carried him to the well," she whispered, threw a wet blanket over him, and prayed harder than I ever had before. The man nodded, and his voice softened, dropping into something almost fatherly. "You saved him, but you never came back, not once, not even to explain." "I thought he was better off," she said, tears falling freely now. "I thought he needed a clean life, not one tied to a woman breaking inside." From the porch steps, a young man emerged, tall, lean, with eyes that mirrored hers too closely to be coincidence, holding a folded coat in his hands. He walked straight toward her, no hesitation, and placed the coat gently around her shoulders like he'd been waiting all his life for that moment. "I kept it," he said simply, "the last thing you touched before you disappeared, and I always wondered if I'd see you wearing it again." She looked into his eyes, and this time there was no fog, no doubt, only the raw clarity of a truth returning home after far too long. "I'm your mother," she said, the words almost weightless, as if the wind carried them instead of her lungs, "and I never stopped loving you." The young man nodded once, jaw clenched tight, and then asked the one question she wasn't expecting, "Then why did you change your name?" "I had to become someone else," she said slowly, her voice carrying the weight of too many miles and too many silences, "because the person I was, she saw something that no one ever should." The boy, no longer a boy, really, but still her son in the way no years could erase, stood quietly, waiting for more, his hands clenched at his sides. The breeze stirred the tall grass around them, sending waves rippling across the field like time itself had paused to listen to what she was about to confess. She turned slightly, her gaze drifting back toward the blackened foundation of the old house, the charred stones still holding the memory of a night that had never ended. "It wasn't the fire that changed me," she continued, her eyes distant, "it was what came after, when I learned that fire doesn't just burn wood, it burns trust." Alan moved closer now, standing just within earshot, not to interrupt but to bear witness, like a man who knew every truth needed at least one companion. She took a deep breath, slow and measured, and her voice came steadier now, like a river finding its current again after a long drought. "There was a man," she said, not looking at anyone now, "a friend of your father's. He helped us rebuild the barn the year before the fire." The young man frowned slightly, as if he'd heard parts of this story in whispers but never dared to put them together until now. He came around often, she said, her hands now wringing together, too often, with gifts and jokes, and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She paused again, and for a moment it seemed as if she might fold inward, but the dog brushed against her leg, grounding her in the present. One night, I stayed behind to clean up, she continued, voice low now, like it hurt to let the words pass through, and he didn't leave when your father did. The silence that followed was long and thick, like a door slowly creaking open in a house no one had dared to enter in decades. I fought him, she said, her voice suddenly sharp with memory. I screamed until my voice cracked, but the walls don't listen when nobody's home. Alan's eyes closed for a moment, his jaw set tight, not with surprise, but with sorrow, the kind a man carries when he knows what's coming next. And afterward, she whispered, tears now sliding freely, I lit the lantern to find my way out, but it slipped, shattered, and the fire took everything. The wind picked up then, like nature itself reacting to the confession, rustling the dead leaves in the yard like scattered memories trying to find order. The young man took a step forward, his face torn between disbelief and the dawning realization that the silence of his childhood had always meant something deeper. You didn't run from us, he said slowly, more to himself than to her, you ran from the ghosts you thought would follow us forever. She nodded, a quiet motion, and for the first time since the fire she allowed herself to look at her son without fear of what he might see. I changed my name, she said, steady now, not to hide from justice, but to survive the shame I thought I had to carry alone. There was no thunderclap, no dramatic pause, just a long breath shared between mother and son, both older now, both scarred, but standing in the same light at last. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed, crinkled, the headline barely legible, local woman missing after farmhouse fire, foul play suspected. I found this when I turned 16, he said, voice barely a whisper, I've carried it ever since, waiting for the day I could ask, why? She took the paper in her hands, and as she unfolded it, something shifted in her expression, pain, yes, but also relief, like the wound had finally found air. The three of them stood there, mother, son, and Alan, framed by a day that had begun like any other but had turned into something none of them could have planned. From behind them, the nurse in white reappeared, walking carefully along the gravel path, a satchel slung across her shoulder and a gentle urgency in her step. There's someone else, she said softly, looking to the older woman, someone you left behind, and she never forgave you for walking away. The woman's eyes narrowed, not in anger but in curiosity, as if sensing that the next truth would cost more than the last. Who? She asked, voice calm now, resolved, ready for whatever came next. She called you mother once, the nurse replied, her voice steady yet softened by something old and sacred, and she still keeps your photo in her wallet. The older woman turned her head slowly, her hands still trembling slightly from the weight of the newspaper clipping, her eyes narrowing not from confusion but the stirrings of memory. Alan walked ahead to open the car door, moving with that same quiet grace he'd carried through every mile, as if fate had handed him the map. The German shepherd climbed in first, as though he knew this stop would require more than just presence, it would demand grace, forgiveness, and something deeper than words. The drive was quiet at first, just the hum of the road and the occasional chirp of birds breaking the silence, as if the world itself was watching gently. She was the last one you left, the nurse said gently, as the town faded behind them and trees rose like sentinels on either side of the road. After the fire, she continued, when you fled into the night, she was the one they couldn't place, the one no one claimed. The older woman closed her eyes, and the silence inside the car changed, not heavier, not colder, just more honest, like a secret no longer safe in the dark. She was 5, she whispered, the words slow and cracked, like old wood shifting beneath weight, and she had this little sweater with stars sewn into the cuffs. Alan glanced into the rearview mirror but said nothing, because sometimes the best kindness a man can offer is simply to let a woman speak. I didn't give birth to her, the woman continued, now opening her eyes again, but I gave her everything I had left, my hands, my stories, my name. She called me Mama, she added, a slight smile curling at the edge of her lips, even when I said she didn't have to. The road curved sharply, then rose up into a small bluff, where a cluster of brick buildings sat nestled in tall trees, quiet and unbothered by the noise of the world. They pulled up in front of the largest structure, a converted schoolhouse with white-trimmed windows and a porch that creaked even before anyone stepped on it. "She volunteers here," the nurse said, already stepping out, "says it reminds her that someone chose her once, even if only for a while." The older woman stepped out of the car, her knees stiff but her steps firm now, her eyes locked on the building like it owed her something. Inside, the smell of old books and chalk dust filled the air, simple, familiar, the scent of memories stacked in rows just waiting to be remembered. At the far end of the hallway, beside a door marked Art Room, stood a woman in her early 40s, hair pinned back, apron smudged with paint. She turned when she heard the footsteps, and for a long, slow moment, time did something strange. It didn't stop, but it circled back like a bird returning to a forgotten nest. Her eyes widened, but her body didn't move, like her heart leapt forward while her bones stayed anchored in the fear of disappointment. "You," she said, barely more than a breath, "I thought you were dead." "I almost was," the older woman answered, her voice firm now, not out of pride but because pain, once named, can't always be denied. "I waited," the younger woman said, her hands balling into fists, "for days, then weeks, and then for years until waiting became just something I did between heartbreaks." The older woman stepped closer, slow and careful, like approaching a bird on a windowsill, knowing even love can fly away if startled too quickly. "I didn't know how to come back," she said, her voice cracking only once, "not when I'd left without even a note, without a reason." The younger woman pulled something from her apron, a faded photo, wrinkled at the edges, showing a little girl in a star-cuffed sweater on a tire swing. "You told me I was brave," she said, eyes filled with tears, "but I only ever learned how to survive, not how to stop missing you." They stood there, not touching, but something passed between them all the same, a current of something ancient, like sorrow buried inside hope, refusing to fade completely. "I was wrong to leave," the older woman whispered, and that sentence, just that, seemed to shift the entire hallway, like gravity had finally been acknowledged. "You were the first person who ever looked at me and said I mattered," the younger woman replied, her tears falling freely now. "I didn't know if you'd want to see me," the older woman said, "not after everything I broke, including you." The younger woman stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, but then placed the photo gently into her hand, fingers brushing like a thread being retied. "I don't know what we are now," she said softly, "but I know what we were, and I still carry that with me." They embraced, not tightly at first, but deeply, like two parts of a life finally being stitched back together after too many seasons apart. And when the hug broke, the older woman looked into her eyes and asked, "Is there anything you still need to know?" The younger woman nodded once and said, "Yes, why did you never tell me about the child you lost before you found me?" "Because I thought she was gone forever," the older woman said, trembling as though the very memory shook the breath from her lungs, "and if I ever spoke her name, I feared I'd stop breathing." The younger woman stood still, hands folded tightly before her, the room suddenly too quiet, the smell of paint and turpentine replaced by something much heavier. The dog lay at their feet now, tail resting still, eyes half closed, not asleep, but listening with the kind of silence only old souls possess. Alan lingered by the doorway, not intruding, but watching closely, as if he knew they had entered the most fragile place in the story so far. "She was my first," the older woman whispered, her voice worn and wind-split, like something buried too long under soil and sorrow, "the one I prayed for before I ever knew what real love would demand of me." The younger woman lowered herself onto a nearby bench, not because she was tired, but because truth, when spoken plainly, has a way of softening the knees. "She would have been 5 the year I found you," the older woman continued, with copper curls and a laugh that could lift the wallpaper right off the walls. Her eyes glazed slightly, not with confusion, but the sharp clarity of someone reliving a scene in perfect detail, as if the years between had only paused the reel. "I left her with my sister one afternoon," she said, voice cracking like old glass, "just to run into town for sugar and a spool of thread. When I came back, she went on, every syllable a wound reopening, the front gate was open, the dog barking like he'd seen a ghost, and no one answered the door. The younger woman covered her mouth, tears sliding down without effort, her voice muffled but steady as she whispered, "They told me you never had another child." No one believed me, the older woman replied, staring out the window as though it could somehow show her that day again, not the police, not my sister, not even my husband at the time. They said I made her up, she said, laughing bitterly now, claimed the grief was something I'd invented to excuse the drinking, the forgetting, the silence that followed. The art room was quiet, every canvas leaning against the walls like witnesses, every unfinished painting now suspended between 2 decades of truth. She disappeared, the older woman said finally, vanished like fog in the morning, and I carried that weight into every decision I ever made after that day. The younger woman stood again, crossing to her, holding her arms not with pity, but with the steadiness of someone who understands what it means to lose something without explanation. "I wasn't meant to replace her," she said softly, "but maybe I was meant to help you remember what it felt like to love again." The older woman nodded slowly, brushing a thumb against her cheek, her eyes locked now not on the past, but the face before her. "She had a name," the woman said, barely above a whisper, "but I haven't said it aloud in over 40 years. The younger woman waited, not pushing, just breathing with her, like a partner waiting for the second step in a long-forgotten dance. "Eleanor," she said finally, and the name hovered between them, sacred and small, like the first note of a song no one had dared to hum. Alan stepped forward, placing a hand gently on the old woman's shoulder, his voice soft but certain as he said, "We need to go to the library." The younger woman looked confused at first, then curious, then concerned, her eyebrows narrowing as she asked, "Why would we go there now?" Alan looked at the older woman, then at the younger one, and replied quietly, "Because there's an adoption notice in a file from 1963, and it lists your name as the mother." "They told me the baby died," the woman said as the lights of the old library flickered above them, casting shadows that moved like memories across the shelves, and I believed them, because I needed to. Alan held the door for her, his hand firm but gentle on the worn brass handle, as if this place, this quiet cathedral of forgotten stories, deserved reverence. The younger woman followed close behind, arms wrapped tight across her chest, her steps echoing softly on the tile, as if each one asked a question she wasn't yet ready to speak aloud. The German shepherd led the way, not barking, not sniffing, just walking with that same unshakable purpose, like every hallway knew him by name. They made their way past the card catalogs, past the quiet sigh of the heating vents, past the places where children once whispered secrets between pages. In the back corner, beneath a faded photograph of a long-retired librarian and a plaque honoring the library's opening in 1924, sat the local history files. Alan knelt down, hands moving like clockwork, pulling drawers open and searching through brittle folders, each one thick with the lives of people long gone or never quite found. The older woman stood behind him, her breath uneven, her hands clenched tightly at her sides like she was trying to keep her ribs from splitting apart. "They told me she was stillborn," she said, her voice raw now, stripped of pretense, "and I begged to see her, to hold her just once." The younger woman moved beside her, slipping a hand into hers, not with pity, but with that fierce steadiness that only comes when you've walked through your own fire. Alan paused, pulling out a pale green folder with a brass tag that read March, April, 1963, Infant Adoptions, Private and Emergency. He laid it on the table, gently as a coffin lid, and opened it slowly, the paper inside so yellowed it looked like it might dissolve in the light. "There," he said, pointing to a form with smudged ink and faded typewritten lines, "Female child, unnamed, birth mother listed by initials, MHW." The older woman leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat, because those were her initials before the marriage, before the fire, before the world had begun to split. She traced the lines of the page with her fingertip, trembling as she reached the adoption records, where the child had been taken into state custody and placed with a family upstate. "They told me she didn't survive the birth," she whispered again, as if trying to reconcile the words on the page with the silence she'd lived inside for decades. The younger woman bent forward, scanning the form, and then noticed something. the adopted child had been renamed Eleanor Grace Wilson, adopted just 10 days after the supposed death. She wasn't gone, the older woman said, tears falling now not out of sorrow, but disbelief so deep it could only be met with awe. They took her from me. Alan nodded slowly, his jaw tight, because a man like him knew the world wasn't always cruel for no reason, but sometimes the reason didn't matter one damn bit. I asked too many questions, the older woman said, her voice low and bitter. They said I was unstable, grieving wrong, unfit, because I couldn't stop crying. And then the younger woman turned to her, a strange light in her eyes now, like a fire being kindled not by rage, but by truth. There's someone you need to meet, she said, pulling out her phone and tapping through photos, stopping on a picture of a woman with copper curls and the same eyes. She's my friend, she said softly, her name is Ellie, she's 42, adopted as a baby, raised in the very county listed here. The older woman took the phone, her thumb brushing the glass like it was something holy, her breath shallow now, like her lungs forgot how to hope. She's been looking for her birth mother for years, the younger woman added gently, but she never had a name, only the initials MHW and a nurse's bracelet. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't heavy, it was full, thick with the gravity of something long buried clawing its way toward the light. The older woman sat down slowly, the photo still in her hands, her voice breaking as she asked, will she even want to see me after all this? She's already outside, the younger woman said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear, hope, and something quieter, something close to awe, and she brought something you gave her the day she was born. The library air seemed to still, as though the dust itself refused to move until the truth could finish stitching its way through time. The older woman stared down at the photo still glowing on the phone screen, her thumb resting gently on the edge of her daughter's face. I thought she was gone, she whispered again, more to herself than to anyone else. I carried that grief like a shadow no one could see. Alan laid a hand on her shoulder, not pressing, not urging, just anchoring her like a lighthouse does for ships lost in fog. The dog stood suddenly, ears alert, tail stiff, not nervous, but ready, as if he, too, understood that everything they'd walked through had led to this threshold. The younger woman moved toward the door first, holding it open like a sacred invitation, not just to walk outside, but to step into something holy. Outside, the air was warm and still, the sun hanging low in the late afternoon sky, casting long shadows that made the world feel deeper somehow. Standing by the edge of the stone steps, beneath the gentle arch of a maple tree, was a woman with copper hair and tired eyes that carried decades of unanswered questions. In her hands, carefully wrapped in soft linen, she held a bracelet, small, silver, the letters EGW etched into the worn plate, beside a rusted clasp. The older woman stepped out slowly, each footfall deliberate, her eyes never leaving the face of the woman who had once lived only in dreams and missing pages. And then the woman with the copper hair smiled, just slightly, just enough, and her lips parted as she said the words that shattered and rebuilt everything in one breath. Are you the woman who used to hum, "You Are My Sunshine," while rocking me to sleep in the hospital nursery? The older woman covered her mouth, nodding slowly, her legs faltering for a moment before the dog leaned gently into her, holding her steady with silent devotion. I remember, the younger woman said, stepping forward, voice shaking, your hands smelled like lavender, and even though I was just a baby, I remember the warmth. They stood just a few feet apart now, close enough to feel each other's breath, and the older woman, through tears she no longer tried to hide, whispered, I never stopped searching, even when I was too tired to admit it. The woman with the copper hair reached out slowly, lifting the bracelet between them, and said, I've kept it all these years, because I knew someone gave it to me with love. They embraced then, mother and daughter, not in a way meant for cameras or perfect memories, but in that broken, trembling way that only two hearts separated by lies can finally understand. Behind them, Alan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, clearing his throat not out of discomfort, but out of reverence for what had just been returned. The younger woman from the art room stood silently to one side, her arms folded, a small, knowing smile on her lips like someone watching a circle finally close. The dog laid down on the step, head resting on his paws, his tail thumping once as if to say, my job is nearly done. The sun dipped lower, gold spilling across the brick, and the older woman leaned back slightly, looking into her daughter's eyes and saying, "I didn't remember you, but I never forgot what it felt like to love you." And that's when the truth, not just one thread, but the whole tapestry, finally revealed itself, not with a bang, but with a quiet, soul-deep understanding. The reason the dog knew where to go, the reason each place stirred something inside her before the memories ever returned, was because he hadn't come to remind her of her past. He had come to lead her through the hearts she'd planted in the world, one by one, so she could remember who she truly was. She wasn't just a woman who'd lost her memory. She was the kind of woman who gave so much of herself to others, that they had been carrying pieces of her all along. The dog stood again, stretched his legs, and looked up at her one last time, eyes gleaming, as if to ask, "Do you remember now?" She knelt down slowly, her fingers brushing his fur, her voice clear and full for the first time in years. "Yes," she said. "I remember everything." Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care.